Good morning and welcome to our post-panel budget panel discussion. It's jointly hosted by ETM Analytics, Econometrics, and Treasury One. Just quickly to introduce the panel, starting from my right-hand side, is the Head of Research and Director George Glynos at ETM. We also have Andre Cilliers, the Currency Strategist at Treasury One. We're also joined by Dr. Azar Jameen. He is the Director at Econometrics. And our special guest this morning, Dr. Oscar van Heerden, a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for African Diplomacy from the University of Johannesburg. So thank you very much for joining me, gentlemen, for this very interesting post-budget panel discussion. Now, it's never easy to construct a budget when you kind of already know beforehand that the things aren't going to balance, the outlook is not looking great. And Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana got onto the podium. He did his thing. He was in the hot seat yesterday. And he also went as far to copy Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address, where he quoted the late President Nelson Mandela when he said, after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. Now, Azar, you're going to dive deeper for us into the budget. And when you look at this budget and the picture that it creates of the fiscal state of South Africa and the economy, you kind of get the impression that the state might be responsible for some of the hills that we now have to climb as South Africans.
Good morning thank you, Ilse Marie. Good morning to all the listeners. Firstly, may I thank ETM Analytics, our parent company, and Andre Cilliers and Treasury One for sponsoring and assisting in organizing this. This is the 41st budget conference that Econometrics has held together with our parent company and our sponsors. Thank you very much for attending. Yes, this was obviously a budget that everyone knew was couched in terms of severe constraints on the fiscal side. The government, we have known, is been collecting less revenue than anticipated. Economic growth has disappointed, and as a consequence, government revenue has been quite weak. But in that context, some of the outcomes that we saw in the numbers were surprisingly positive. The Treasury has managed to engineer a reduced budget deficit for the next 3 years compared with what it had predicted in the November medium-term budget policy statement. And because this implies it's had to have less pressure to borrow, the projection of the public debt to GDP ratios is now that much lower than it was at the time of the MTBPS. And on the face of it, this is a fairly positive outcome. And that's why we saw a little bit of positivity in the Rand soon after the budget was actually presented. But if one looks a little more deeply, one realizes that the government has been quite expeditious in the way in which it has exploited certain opportunities, almost on a once-off basis, to project a better fiscal situation, to project what meets the eye as a better fiscal situation than previously believed. But fundamentally, I don't believe anything has changed dramatically. How has it done this? It's the biggest change that has occurred has been, which was basically anticipated to a certain extent, was the exploitation of the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account. This is basically an unrealized gain on exchange rate depreciation of the Rand vis-a-vis the dollar, pound, and euro, the currencies in which the Reserve Bank holds our foreign exchange over the last 2 decades. And suddenly, with the Rand as weak as it is, we realize that there is 500 billion Rand in that kitty. And the government, the kitty actually belongs to the government itself. The Reserve Bank doesn't have the opportunity to dictate to what happens. And so the government has basically decided to take 150 billion Rand of that to retire some of the debt. On the face of it, one is grateful that at least this artificial measure has been used to bring down public debt, rather than to be wasted away in other forms of unfruitful expenditure. But the net effect of this has been, with a lower debt to GDP ratio than we previously believed. 150 billion rand is about 2 to 2.5% of GDP, and with that benefit of less debt than we previously believed we would have, debt servicing costs have also come down slightly from a projected peak of 22% of government revenue to 21% of government revenue. Obviously, debt servicing is a very important element of total government spending. So this has meant that government spending growth has been reduced, if you want to say artificially. And that in turn feeds through into meaning that we need to borrow slightly less than previously believed. And that feeds through positively into the public debt. On top of that, there were a couple of other expeditious measures that the government took. Firstly, we know that from the beginning of this past fiscal year, globally it was agreed to introduce a 15% minimum tax on profits of multinational corporations made in different parts of the world. And this was a wonderful opportunity for the government to step in to impose that tax and to estimate that it will get an extra 8 billion rand in revenue from that form of tax. Then the third area of extra tax revenue came, no surprise, Godongwana in the MTBPS had warned us that we would have to get 15 billion rand extra in tax revenue from some source. The obvious one was that that equates to approximately the amount that is increased in tax by people moving up the tax ladder as they get salary increases. And if there is no adjustment of the tax brackets, they end up paying more effective tax. And the total quantum of that amounts to 15 billion rand. And the attraction of that is, of course, that that tax tends to fall again on, if you want to call it, the fat cats, you and I, people who are employed, who earn a reasonable income or a very good income, and you carry the burden of that tax. The other one that is a discretionary form of expenditure, also bearing a higher tax rate, has been sin taxes, whose the taxes of which have been raised by more than inflation. Against that, in an election year, what does the government do? It forgoes raising the fuel levy. This is very unusual. For year after year after year, we have seen fuel levies rising in line with inflation. This time, no increase in the fuel levy, and that's a 4 billion rands worth of tax relief to counteract to some extent the negative effects on disposable income of the additional 15 billion and 8 billion in the other forms of taxation. Of course, one of the elephant in the room to some extent is the extent to which on the expenditure side, the government will allow public sector wages to grow. In this budget, it has printed an estimate of around 4.5% per annum increase in public sector wages. Can we rely on that? Big question. At the beginning of last year, we were told public sector wages would grow by no more than 1.8% per annum on average. And we had big fights by the unions, and the government succumbed and agreed to a 7.5% increase. And that is a huge problem we now face. Potentially, if the government doesn't stick to these increases. And when you bear in mind that public sector remuneration amounts to over 700 billion rand, every 1% increase in public sector remuneration amounts to 7 billion rand that has to be found from tax revenue. The government did not succumb to pressures to increase the value of social grants by more than inflation to help the poor. Instead, social grants have been increased roughly in line with inflation, except the social relief or distress grant, which has been left at 350 rand a month. And the government says it's looking into ways of alleviating that. And then the final very interesting one was the allocation of 1.4 billion rand to the National Health Insurance Scheme as a sop to the support base. In the broader scheme of things, 1.4 billion rand is a tiny amount of additional expenditure being devoted to the NHI. But it was useful to bring it in to the budget to convey that the government is determined to bring the NHI in as a means of appeasing its support base and the poor who can't afford medical aid schemes. If we then move on to just look at the context of the budget, what we see is this picture of South Africa's GDP growth. Look how nicely we did 2 decades ago. And then from around 2014, you can see this pace of economic growth has progressively slowed. We had a huge dip in the COVID pandemic crisis, recovery, and we're kind of eking out growth to take us up slightly higher than where we were pre-pandemic. But essentially, you can see for the last 6 years, we simply have trodden water, and given a population growth rate of 1.6% per annum, it means a decline of that order of magnitude on average in living standards. It also, this right-hand table shows you South Africa's growth forecast by the IMF compared with other major economies. Yeah, we're set to do better than the Eurozone and the UK over the coming year, but not next year. And then, but you've got to bear in mind that they have very little population growth. We have 1.6% population growth. So yes, we are not the worst in the world, but we are weak certainly compared with emerging markets where the growth rates are projected at over 4% per annum. If we then move on to bear in mind what has been causing this very low economic growth, I've highlighted here a set of 12 important structural impediments that are preventing this economy from growing faster than a trajectory of around 1%. Obviously, corruption and the way this is fed through into debilitating state-owned enterprises, and in particular, the security of energy supply, the efficiency of processing goods at our ports and operating a decent rail network, all have contributed towards low economic growth. In particular, until recently, and I'll come back to some of the good news, is that investment spending has been lagging behind consumer spending. You can't carry on like that indefinitely. You need to be able to invest in order to supply the goods and services you need in the longer term. And that wasn't the case until more recently. And of course, we have flip-flops on economic policy all the time, creating a lot of uncertainty that has not been conducive to investment. We've had over-regulation and bureaucracy that has been absolutely stifling, especially for small business activity. And this is due to a state that has not deliberately opposed embracing the private sector to resolve many of these problems, even though a lot of the skills in the country reside in the private sector. And the lack of capacity to implement infrastructural and other service delivery projects can be linked directly to the inefficiencies in public sector entities, especially municipalities, resulting from the policy of cadre deployment, where people have been appointed to positions not because of their capability and qualifications, but because of their loyalty to the ruling party, and in particular to the big knobs within the ruling party. Another big factor that has impaired our ability to spend on infrastructure, crime, sabotage, law and order that have really deteriorated in recent years. And finally, underlying all these is the very poor educational outcomes, especially in areas of maths and science, in a world where technology is really becoming more and more sought after. Now, let's go through some immediate concerns, some of which I've mentioned. Energy insecurity. There's a bit of good news. Look at how the intensity of load shedding has actually declined over the last 6-9 months. And that is one of the reasons why the government has felt comfortable to project a slightly higher economic growth rate for 2024 than had been anticipated. The second big constraint has obviously been the deterioration in our transport network. Firstly, the massive deterioration in rail, forcing a lot of freight trade to have to go through road, messing up our roads and causing potholes. And secondly, our port facilities that have deteriorated, leading to a 40% odd decline in the amount of traffic that we've been able to push through our harbours. Again, some good news, like with electricity, there are signs of an improvement since the leadership of Transnet was changed late last year. We've seen a slight improvement in their throughput of trade through our ports. So small, thank heavens for small mercies. Nonetheless, of course, load shedding and logistical bottlenecks, supply side shortages have really crippled the productive sectors of the economy. You can see both mining and manufacturing are way down from where they were prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And the government keeps talking about trying to re-industrialize the South African economy. Yeah, there's a few signs of it starting to occur now, but not massive. And then the area of the economy that was doing relatively well, which is consumer spending, is starting to lose some of its luster. If you look at the retail sales and passenger vehicle sales in recent times, you can see both of these have dipped somewhat. Growth has dipped most recently. And that is because of high interest rates on top of load shedding and a general lack of confidence. But we are looking towards interest rates starting to come down later in the year. So hopefully that might provide a little lifeline to consumer spending. The really positive development until recently was the fact that this debilitating long-term trend that I alluded to of falling capital investment relative to rising consumer spending has tended to be reversed. Fixed capital formation has increased quite nicely, except in Q3 of last year. One hopes that that has not been sustained. But quite clearly, what is happening is we're seeing a bit of investment activity taking place in the form of renewable energy projects and in the form of establishing a transmission grid to bring back renewable energy from the Eastern and Northern Cape into the heartland of the economy in Gauteng and Mpumalanga, etc. And that is probably one of the most encouraging features. There's also quite a bit of investment in IT, not in construction activity. But the higher level of investment has been incorporated into the forecasts made by the Treasury for the next 3 years. And you can see the red is what was forecast in the MTBPS. The black is the latest forecast. And you can see we're talking about fixed investment growth of 3 to 4% per annum, compared with consumer spending growth of just 1.5% per annum. But overall, the government has improved its forecast growth for this year to 1.3% from 1% previously, and that has assisted it in projecting improvement in government revenue that in turn has fed through into a reduction in the fiscal deficit compared with what we had anticipated. In turn, where is the source of the gains in government revenue? Not surprisingly, you can see there's a turnaround, or certainly a big increase in revenue expected from personal tax. By not adjusting those tax brackets, we see a substantial projected increase in personal income tax of around 14% for this year, dropping back to 6 and 8% in the ensuing couple of years. To make up in some extent for the dramatic fall off in revenue from corporate tax, remember in 2022, we had a significant bonanza in terms of rising coal and platinum group metal prices, and that has disappeared and forced the government into looking for alternative sources of revenue. Of course, it's an uncomfortable position for the income earners in this country. There are only 12% of all the population who earn enough to register for tax. And you can see here, cumulatively, 76% of all tax in South Africa is paid by just 3% of the population. Of all personal tax, 3% of the population pays that. So that gives you an idea of the warped nature of our income distribution and of our tax liability, and why the government dare not raise personal taxes too much. 13% increase in personal tax is going to weigh down on consumer spending, but not dramatically so. You can see the source of the decline in government corporate tax revenue, massive decline in coal prices, a decline in platinum and palladium prices as well, and all these commodity prices, with the exception most recently of gold, have actually been depressed in recent times, compelling the government to look for personal tax as the main source of additional revenue. And what we end up with is a big improvement forecast in government tax revenue, to 6% growth in the coming fiscal year from just 1% in the past year. And combined with expenditure growing at 4.6% per annum, this has allowed the government to, now you can see, this is, the black is the most recent budget deficit in yesterday's budget. The green is what was budgeted for in the medium-term budget policy statement in November. The orange is what was budgeted for in last year's budget. Obviously, because of the revenue shortfall in the past year, the budget deficit for 2023-24 has been raised. But notice how it's been reduced for 2025, it's been reduced for 25-26, and it's been reduced for 26-27. And this has come as a bit of a surprise, and it emanates largely because of the raid into the FECRA account and the ability to reduce our public debt levels and therefore our debt servicing costs. You can see now the projected budget deficit in the red one is somewhat less than what was being forecast in earlier years. Of course, there was a big increase in the budget deficit during the COVID crisis because activity in the economy slumped and government revenue hardly grew. The net effect of this has been to reduce the projected trajectory of public debt to GDP to reach a peak now of 75.3% in 2025-26, instead of, as projected in November, a peak of 77.7%. So it's a reduction of around 2.5% of GDP in the public debt. And that, of course, has translated into a reduction in the interest burden on public debt from projecting a peak of 22.2% in a couple of years' time to projecting a peak of just 21.1% right now. So it's a slight improvement. It has opened the way for, that means just over 1% less spending on interest payments on public debt, and that has fed through into a reduced expenditure. And that's why the Rand seemed to receive the news fairly favorably yesterday. But notice, however, the Rand over the last 3 years has weakened fairly dramatically against the US dollar, and even on a trade-weighted basis, it has weakened considerably over these years. And on a real trade-weighted basis, the currency is very cheap compared with where it has been trading in the last 30 years. It's not, has been cheaper still, and every time that it hits these low points, it tends to recover. But we are noticing on this occasion, instead of the strong recoveries that we've had in the past, we are hesitating at around 18.5, 19 Rand to the dollar, to be precise. And that is because we know well we are not out of the woods, and we have been using artificial means to basically try and improve the fiscal situation. At least the government is maintaining an element of austerity, and for that one must be very grateful. It did not succumb to bailing out SOEs in a big way in this latest budget that most people feared, but it has kind of achieved its austerity in a fairly expeditious way, and one gets worried that it won't be able to do it again. Having said that, we're not doing a bad job relative to many other leading economies. You can see how public debt levels around the world have increased enormously over the past decade, the big exception being Germany, that has been able to rein in its public debt to GDP ratio. But all the other main countries are looking at, Italy has also brought down its public, or is projected to bring down its public debt, but it's so high at 150% of GDP. The US, very, very important. And of course, the advanced economies look at the trajectory, and that's a big fear for the world economy over the next few years. So in that context, South Africa is not doing too badly, but our public debt levels at around 75% of GDP are significantly higher than the average of peer economies, emerging market economies, which are estimated by Fitch to be around 52% of GDP. In this graph, it shows emerging market debt at somewhat higher levels, at similar to, not too dissimilar from South Africa. So, in that context, it's not too bad. But remember that we are compelled to pay a very much higher interest rate on the debt that we issue compared with other leading countries such as the United States. And that big gap between South African interest rates and American and other interest rates, Europe even lower, is the risk premium attached to a lack of confidence that the government will actually rectify our declining growth scenario in such a way as to improve our government revenues, and in so doing, reduce the public debt to GDP ratio. If you ask most analysts, they will tell you they don't believe that public debt will peak at 75% of GDP. Our own projection is looking at a public debt rising more to 85, closer to 90% of GDP in the next 5 years, largely because we're forecasting slightly lower growth rates even than the government itself is doing. And so the key to remedying this situation and reducing the penalty that we keep paying in terms of high interest rates compared with other countries is to improve economic growth. In terms of expenditure, the positive thing about this budget is that the government has budgeted to raise its expenditure on capital projects and to raise capital spending from 4.7% to 5.5% of the budget over the next 3 years. And on the other side, though, very little success is being projected in terms of reducing the enormous weight of public sector remuneration on the overall budget. And public sector remuneration is projected to remain at around just under 32% of the total budget. And many will bemoan that not more could have been done to reduce the public debt. As things stand, remember that there is a tail to bear, the costs to bear of a tailwind of the huge buildup of public debt that we've seen in recent years. Even with the ability to bring down the public debt, projected public debt to GDP ratio of the next few years, the share of public debt to GDP is public debt to government spending is still forecast to increase over the next 3 years. And if you look at the breakdown of government spending, yes, it's very encouraging to see that the 3-year projection of capital expenditure is set to rise again by more or less in line with projected inflation, slightly less, from 903 to 944 billion rand, after having been, but over a year, from 812 billion to 944 billion. That's a nice increase in capital spending. But within consumption expenditure, if you look at the overall, I know it's a very busy chart, but you can see the overall expenditure growth set to remain at 4.6% per annum on average over the next 3 years, with the highest growth rate being still in the form of debt servicing costs, even though the growth rate has come down, now projected at 7.3% growth per annum in interest payments from 8.7% believed previously. It's still by far the highest growth rate compared with all these other areas of encouragement, a bit of an increase in spending projected on basic education and on healthcare, and of course the 1.4 billion on the NHI forms part of that. But more generally, we don't see any major curtailment of the growth of government spending. At the same time, there is no major increase forecast. In conclusion, there is a bit of a relief, I think, for financial markets emanating from the fact that the government has been able to reduce its budget deficit and the trajectory of public debt. However, one must caution that this has been achieved through some expedient once-off measures, like the raiding the gold and foreign exchange capital gains, the once-off the introduction of a 15% tax on MNCs, as well as taxing private individuals more by stealth in terms of not allowing for compensation for the impact of bracket creep and moving up the tax ladder. So should one be positive or negative in terms of using the approach that they've done? I suppose there's a bit of a mixed picture in this regard. There are some who will say, no, well, they've made hay while the sun shines, which is positive and of course obvious ahead of elections. But on the other side, there are those who say, hang on a moment, it's all fake. But at the same time, it wasn't a bad budget from that. We knew the constraints that existed. The big elephant in the room remains, will they be able to stick to restraining public sector wage increases to just 4.5% per annum? Or will they once again succumb to public sector unions and agree to increases of 7.5%? This has been killing this economy. And theoretically, I suppose one of the positives is that once again, there is an intention to spend more on infrastructure, and that's a very favorable development, I suppose. The key is, will they actually implement their intention? And clearly, there was a lot in this budget that was geared towards sending a good message, especially to the poor, not getting more. But at the same time, I mean, there was nothing to make one feel that the government is really getting to grips with the fundamental structural impediments to economic growth that are restricting its ability to produce really good budgets. From a long point of view, those structural impediments still remain in place. And I think George is going to talk around, and Professor van Heerden are going to talk around whether or not the general election that we're forecasting in May will be able to bring about a new political dispensation that is more amenable and conducive towards lifting the overall economic growth rate in the country to enable us to generate tax revenues needed to reduce public debt and budget deficits. Thank you very much.
So nothing unexpected in the budget. We knew the picture was not going to look great. It doesn't look great, but some light points here and there. It's always good to know that at least we're not alone in our debt trajectory. You know, we're not the only ones fighting this fight. But Azar, thank you so much for that deep dive. By the way, to our viewers, if anyone has comments for any of our panelists, please feel free to start leaving those questions in the comment section. We'll get to them at the end of our presentation. But yesterday's budget obviously also came before what has been coined as this watershed election. Who knows? It might have been Enoch Godongwana's last dance as finance minister yesterday. Or, you know, perhaps the ANC finds a way to hold on to power by their fingertips if needs be. And Oscar, I want to come to you with this now. You know, do you think yesterday's budget went far enough to, at the very least, convince the ANC's traditional voter base or supporter base that, you know, put us back in power, give us another 4 years, we've got the plan in hand to pull South Africa out of the economic slump? Could you just, if you don't mind, just unmute? There you go.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Ilse Marie. You know, the word that's going around in my mind is just generally conservatism. Even listening to Azar now, you know, much more of a conservative approach to some of these things. And again, government, what I saw yesterday with the budget is an ANC that is projecting rather a serious amount of confidence, because they could easily, as a ruling party, have been much more opportunistic. They could have spoken of a basic income grant and massively increased the distress grant, especially since they're now dipping into a contingency fund that has 500 billion rand. And yet they only took 150 billion, you know, to offset the decline of income from SARS, about 56 billion, and add another extra 90 billion to play with, and did what we all thought was just a normal budget, albeit a very good budget, but a very normal budget, nothing out of the ordinary. And I'm saying that it gives a sense of a level of confidence from the ruling party that they feel that the electorate is going to vote them back into power. Otherwise, they could have been much more sort of, you know, bravado in terms of expenditure. They could have massively increased the grants and so on and so forth, but they did not. The austerity element and the conservative element still was there. So I do think that, you know, in terms of the elections, I had thought that this was an opportunity for the ANC government to increase the stress grant from the ordinary 350 in order to bring those recipients more closer and on board for the elections. But this was not the case. They simply said that the grant will remain until next year, but with a slight proviso that there's going to be a committee set up between Treasury and Social Development to try and see how that grant can perhaps transform into something a bit more permanent and a bit bigger. And perhaps that the end result of that might be a basic income grant. I don't know. So general just confidence from Treasury and from the ruling party, I think. The issue around the electorate and citizens, you know, there's obviously uppermost in the minds of everyone is the three triple challenges: unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And I think, again, the budget did try to address those elements. In terms of unemployment, there's been quite a bit of money made available to the presidential stimulus package, which, as we know, resulted in the youth services that gave a huge amount of youth prospects of employment over the last financial year, and as well as putting money into infrastructure development to try and create the necessary jobs that is so desperately needed. I do think perhaps one of the controversial points that I should raise is, I know as economists, people, you know, they always are very concerned with the government wage bill, but I think Azar and others will also agree that if it weren't for government employing so many people, it wouldn't have resulted in the expansion of the black middle class, the numbers looking so good in terms of consumer spending. The government has really, over the last few years, been the single largest employer in the country. And I think that is something that we have to take away from. It doesn't necessarily mean that the wage bill must just continue ballooning. I think that is a valid point to raise. But I think it's important to also mention that, you know, at the end of the day, job creation is ultimately the domain of the private sector. And then, of course, in terms of inequality, they would argue that the various, and I think it's another political point that I should perhaps mention, Ilse Marie, and that is the issue of social welfare. A lot of people have, a lot of critics, a lot of people having a problem with it. But the truth of the matter is that the government has realized that it needs to be a caring government. Prior to COVID, there was the introduction of the child support grant, and that has massively alleviated levels of poverty and so forth in many families. And then, of course, post-COVID, there's the distress grant. So a clear indication of a government that is caring, that is trying to restore dignity, albeit small amounts of money. We in the chattering classes always try and make an argument that, what is 350? But actually, the statistics and the surveys show us that it has a huge impact on people that have nothing in terms of basic consumption of basic goods, airtime in order to be connected and look for jobs, a bit of money for traveling to and from interviews and job seeking and so forth. So it does make a big difference. And I do think that in the absence of creating meaningful employment, there has to be cash in hand. Otherwise, the social problems that we know exist would be far more exacerbated within the country. And I think that people must, in a way, I'd love to see a situation where people's mindset changes with regards to social welfare, because it is such an important thing. Yes, we must always be wary about where the money comes from, but I think we've been having a very delicate balancing act to try and make sure that we do provide for some money for social spending and cash in hand for citizens. And then, of course, the poverty alleviation. It's the same thing. There is some attempt to try and mitigate poverty within the country. As indicated, the poverty levels over the last 30 years have certainly gone down, but there's still much more work that needs to be done in that regard. So the triple challenges somehow was being addressed within this budget. Azar mentioned things that are important to citizens on the ground is that there has been no actual tax increases. There has been no increase on the fuel levy in terms of the cost of living, which makes a huge difference, of course. And then, of course, as I said, there's been general increases in social spending in line with inflation. And I think these are all positives that would people will be aware of them as they go to the polls in May. And I think that's important. Again, from a broader perspective, Azar did mention the fact that they've put more money into the logistics, freight and rail and road. And I think that's important because there has been bottlenecks. It has been an impediment, as Azar has indicated, but quite a bit of money made available, not only in terms of the private sector, but also commuter rail. And I think this is an important thing. 27 corridors that have been reopened since COVID. And that's going to be a massive savings for commuters as well. In the Western Cape, for example, once they sort out the central line, which is still a bit of a difficulty, there's all kinds of politics there in terms of the DA and the ANC. But once that corridor is open, I think that's going to be a massive saving for millions of commuters that is actually, quite honestly, being exploited from the taxi point of view. Taxis are really creaming it with the non-functioning of the central line in the Western Cape. Then there's the government GDP to debt. I think Azar has said enough on that. I do think that government has demonstrated, I think, that they are trying to bring that down. And so I don't know whether I necessarily agree that it will go over 80% to 85% in the medium term. I think government is, the mere fact that they have this unspoken strategy, and it started in 1996 already, where every time there's too much pressure on the fiscus, too much pressure on the budget, they simply come up with austerity measures, in a way enforcing a structural adjustment program on themselves, on the country. And yes, some people obviously feel the pinch of that, but it does mean that government has got this commitment to try and keep things within certain bounds. Infrastructure spending is obviously a good thing. And then there is this issue of the contingency account, which is, I think Azar talks of once-off measures, but this is I would argue this is the point of this account. The reason why it was set up as a contingency fund is so that when there is a rainy day, you dip into it. And I think Treasury Treasury took a chance by introducing the issue and dipping into it. It could have taken much more, but it didn't. And I do think that it's something that we probably, it's the first time I don't know, Azar, you and George would know better. I don't know of any government that actually bets against its own currency. Because effectively, this is what this account is. The more the rand depreciates, the more money this account makes. It's almost, in a way, you don't want the currency to appreciate, because then you have this pot of money that you can dip into. It's a very strange contingency account, but nonetheless, it's there. And I think it was a good thing for Treasury to dip into it and actually alleviate not raising taxes and also not going out and borrowing more money. So from a political point of view, domestically, I think everyone is fairly happy. There are, of course, NGOs and others that would have wanted to see more spending socially, on social grants and so forth. But as I say, government has that element of conservatism and austerity that is built into the system. And maybe it's not a bad thing. As to the actual elections and the outcomes, this has been a good budget for the election year. I think people are probably going to go to the poll saying, we're not extra hard hit. The cost of living is not going up. And there's a bit of more extra money in our pockets. And perhaps that's what is going to pull the ANC over the line, in terms of the elections, at least. Domestically, that's the situation. Then, of course, we also have to be aware of what's the situation globally. And I do think Azar and the others would agree, we are not an island on our own. We are influenced by international trends and so forth. And the situation is quite bleak. I don't know if Azar will agree with me and George, but South Africa is probably, in terms of policy certainty, probably a bit better off than what we're experiencing in the United States and in Europe generally. There's much more uncertainty out there. The global economy there's a forecasting of stagnation. It's not going to go very far. And we obviously going to have to also contend with that. The situation, there's lots of hotspots, what I call hotspots internationally, that is having impact on us as South Africa. And here we're talking about, firstly, the tension between the United States and China, and the ongoing tension there around Taiwan and the South China Seas. And then, of course, there's also the conflict with Russia and NATO that's playing out in the Ukraine. And then, of course, there's also the unfortunate situation in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza. And then closer to home on the continent, there's the Francophone countries that have now decided they're going to be independent and they don't want anything to do with colonial powers such as France. And that in itself has got certain repercussions on the continent, but also globally. And so it's a very uncertain environment globally out there. There's, as I say, there's stagnation that's happening in the global economy. And we've now seen South Africa having to deploy forces again to the DRC and Mozambique for peacekeeping missions, which puts extra strain on the defense budget and so forth. So overall, the outlook is not great. South Africa, I think, has been able to keep its head above water with this budget, but we don't know how long that's going to continue. Thanks, Ilse.
Oscar, thank you very much. The global situation is uncertain. If the polls are anything to go by, I would say the domestic situation might just be as uncertain, and maybe the ruling party shouldn't come across too confidently at this point, but we still have about 2 months to go. But George, we can spin politics whichever way we want, but you always say that, South Africa does not operate in a bubble. And at this point, the international bubble has a number of dents, it's got a number of kicks. It's making life a little bit more difficult for the South African fiscus.
It certainly is. Thanks to the previous two speakers, it's like you quite rightly said, Ilse Marie, we don't operate in a bubble, and it's sometimes worth just taking a step back, pulling back the lens and just having a look at what you are faced with domestically and internationally. And I think the purpose of this is not just to paint context in about the world that South Africa faces and the many uncertainties that exist internationally, but it's also to kind of make the point that in a world of uncertainties, the thing that you need to focus on the most is doing the basics right in your own backyard. And I think that's where South Africa has failed. And it's failed to do that. Oh, now it's been the better part of a decade, and I've got some charts to reflect that. And I think this is the reason why I get so frustrated, both at the politics of this country as well as the economics of it, because it's not the first time. And for those that have seen me presenting on the budget over the past few years, in fact, Azar's been joining me on some of these budget presentations now for the better part of 2 decades, but especially over the last decade, we have often, more often than not, given these budgets a fail. And the reason why we have done so is because we felt that the general trajectory of debt in this country was moving in the wrong direction, and that the policies were not addressing the problems that South Africa faces. And so, it's from that perspective that I'm going to be speaking and just sharing my thoughts on this budget from a completely different perspective to either Dr. van Heerden or Dr. Jameen. So let me jump into it, and let's just start off with something that Dr. van Heerden just raised, and that was the issue of the geopolitics globally. And it's sometimes worth trying to gauge the level of intensity so that you can compare like for like. Now, there are various companies around the world that try to gauge geopolitical tensions, and they try and attribute numbers to them. And so long as their methodology is more or less stable over time, you've got something to work with. And in this particular instance, we've got a geopolitical measure that we've used many times in the past. It gives us a sense of being able to calibrate one geopolitical period versus another. And it was quite interesting to see when the war on Gaza broke, just how intense that geopolitical tension became, bigger even than what we saw during the initial stages of the war in Ukraine. The unfortunate reality is that whilst it did show signs of cooling, it remains well elevated now. And that's a combination of both what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Ukraine. So the two combined mean that we have geopolitical tensions around the world, which do introduce a host of different economic considerations and consequences that the global economy will need to deal with. Naturally, whilst it may be positive for a US military sector, for example, that these wars are going on and that the US is supplying these wars with ammunition and all sorts of other things, it's not necessarily all that positive for the world at large. So you've got developments in Ukraine. We know it impacted the grains markets, it impacted logistics, it did all sorts of damage. Similarly, what we're finding with the war in Gaza is a byproduct of that has been the difficulties that logistics are facing in the Red Sea. So none of that is particularly good news from a growth perspective, and of course is a hindrance. But it hasn't just been about geopolitics. We know that we had an inflation episode not so long ago, and central banks around the world have all had to respond to that inflation episode, and they did so by tightening up monetary policy. They raised interest rates almost across the board, save for a handful of countries on the right-hand side of this chart. Most countries have raised interest rates, and these interest rates are sitting well above core inflation, just to reflect the degree of conservatism in monetary policy at the moment. In this particular chart, I've just circled South Africa versus the US for the sake of comparisons, that you can see where South Africa sits. It's at the more conservative end of the scale, which it deserves to be at. And I can go into some of those reasons, but really it is also about reflecting some of the risk premium that gets baked into South Africa because of the underperformance of government policies in helping South Africa reduce risk. lest we forget, we have slipped way down the rankings of credit ratings. We used to be deep in investment grade. We are now deep in sub-investment grade, and the prognosis isn't a particularly positive one, say for this use of the Jafekra account to help pay down some of the debt in the near term. The trajectory is still one way, and until such time as I see real material proof that it's going to move in the other way, South Africa is going to be forced to deal with levels of interest rates that are otherwise higher than they should have been. And of course, that's another foregone opportunity that South Africa has to face going forward. Internationally, what we're also finding is that globally the business cycle is tightening up. We tend to use this particular indicator as more of a tidal indicator. Money washing into the global economy tends to float a lot of asset prices, give you feel good times. And so if you look at the labels at the top of this chart, that's where all the boom times sit. Conversely, the labels at the bottom of this chart are where the tough times tend to manifest. And so it's important when we're looking at global dollar money supply, whether that tide is coming in or going out. We do know that the US Fed has been raising interest rates, as the previous chart showed. We also know that they have been draining liquidity, approximately 95 billion per month, out of off their central bank balance sheets in the form of quantitative tightening, as they call it. That gradual drainage has so far pulled about 1.4 trillion out of the global dollar liquidity system. They've got another 3.5 odd trillion to go before they get back to where they were pre-COVID. So there's still the potential for a lot more tightening. They are not likely to be looking at reducing interest rates in a hurry. And so it's not surprising that we're starting to see US recession probabilities now beginning to tick up. To Dr. van Heerden's point, there are some fairly significant risks that are arising internationally. This is just one of them, and the US wouldn't be alone. So we know that there are central banks that are now walking a tightrope between trying to rein in inflation whilst at the same time protect GDP growth. The longer they keep interest rates at these levels, the higher the probability that recession will bite. Just pay attention to the y-axis of this chart. It's inverted. So the more that blue line, for example, goes down, the higher the probability of recession. We're currently hovering just below 40%. The minute you start getting close to that 50% mark, that's when you need to start worrying that recession is potentially just around the corner. So the central banks are likely to eventually cut rates. At this stage of the game, they're conservative. It means that for a while still, we need to deal with tighter monetary policies that will detract from economic growth. It means that the business cycles, at least for the next 3 to 6 months, are going to be constrained. It means that the domestic economy equally is going to be constrained and could very well face recessionary type conditions. Nothing that I saw in this budget to me gave me any sense that there is likely to be some strong growth potential coming out of South Africa at all. In fact, if anything, I saw another budget which is going to do very little to lift South Africa's GDP growth. And I agreed with Azar's view that the forecasts going forward are probably softer than those of national treasuries. In fact, we've done a study in-house where we compared national treasuries' forecasts over the past decade to reality. And I would say at least 90 to 95% of the time, government has been far too optimistic on its economic prospects. And only a portion of that can be attributed to offshore events that have detracted from growth. Much of that has been a long list of own goals that South Africa has scored, and we have not utilized our policy positions to offset those. And so we are currently staring at not just domestic constraints, but international ones as well, which will make life quite tough for National Treasury and the authorities in collecting the revenues. That being said, we are anticipating later this year, going into 2025, some relief in the form of lower interest rates. So we do think that these central banks are going to eventually get on top of what we believe is an inflation episode that'll pass. We think that starts to come through around about the middle of this year when inflation moderates further and the central banks feel like they have the capacity to start cutting interest rates. And as they do so, lifting overall GDP growth. What's interesting about this leading indicator chart is that China's already started the process of easing monetary policy, and so their leading indicator, the orange line, has picked up. Internationally, the G20 countries, we're seeing some moderate relief coming through there. Again, forward-looking financial markets are beginning to price in the prospect of lower interest rates to come. But have a look at South Africa. South Africa is still below the break-even 100 index level. In other words, still reflecting deterioration in our future prospects, somewhat deviating away from what we're seeing in other countries and regions around the world. So again, speaking to the kind of economic growth that we're still struggling to generate in this country. As I showed a version of this chart a little bit earlier, but I had a slightly different interpretation of it. Whilst he absolutely pointed out that many other regions around the world are also facing difficulties with their fiscal performance and that the general debt trajectories are rising. What struck me when I looked at this chart is the fact that South Africa's, which is the blue line, our trajectory is rising at a faster pace than whether you look at emerging or developing countries, we are rising at a faster pace. Whether you're looking at advanced countries, we are rising at a faster pace. And if you look at advanced economies, excluding the G7, we are rising at a much faster pace. So in other words, we are doing a worse job of containing our fiscal spending than many other countries around the world. And that's something that needs to be checked, because in a world where you have as much liquidity sloshing around as we do, and in a world where South African financial markets are as liquid and as accessible as they are, you can bet your bottom dollar that there is likely to be speculation against South Africa, because quite frankly, investors who have to gain confidence in an economy's future to part ways with their money and commit their portfolios in that direction, would like to see and would reward a conservative budget a lot more than they would a profligate one. And right now, we are dealing with a country, a government that has done nothing but deliver profligate budget after profligate budget for the better part of a decade. And the numbers are there. They're not mine. They're National Treasury's. The budget deficit data has exceeded GDP growth for a very long time now. We have made very poor inroads in containing that at all. The debt to GDP ratios are rising and rising sharply. And like Azar, we think that the 75% debt to GDP ratio is way too low. It's far too low because it doesn't take into consideration any of the unfunded liabilities that currently don't sit on the government's balance sheet. And very cleverly, they dodged another bullet by simply offering Transnet a debt guarantee, as opposed to rolling that debt onto the government balance sheet, which is just about inevitable. We've seen it happen with Eskom. There's absolutely no reason for me to believe that it won't happen with Transnet, for the simple reason that we see the huge amounts of inefficiencies that are coming through state-owned enterprises, which this government has been unable to contain. So debt trajectories are rising, and they're rising quickly. And if one had to take some of the unfunded liabilities added onto South Africa's debt pile, that 75% changes to 85 and 90% extremely quickly. And that's not the end of it, because you know that South Africa's interest rates are high and rising, and that there is very little confidence in the government's ability to be able to turn the situation around, because they have imposed on this budget a tremendous amount of overheads that are not easily unwound. Now, I know why those overheads exist, and they are there in order to assist the poor in this country and alleviate poverty levels, and we understand that fully. What I don't appreciate is the amount of wasteful expenditure that's taken place, and the amount of debilitating debt that's been built up at a municipal and state-owned enterprise level, which simply cannot be easily undone. So if one has a look at the IMF's data on structural budget balances, it's also important to note where South Africa has come from and where it's expected to go to. And again, this isn't my forecasts. This is the IMF's forecasts, and it gives you a sense of what international economists are anticipating. But the trend is there for you to see, and it's very, very clear. So South Africa is the blue line, and that structural deficit is set to deteriorate down to around about 7% of GDP. What that is a budget deficit effectively adjusted for the effects of a business cycle. You compare that to other regions in the world, and, well, they look substantially different. They don't deteriorate anywhere near to the same degree. And so, again, South Africa has to take a long, hard look at itself to decide how it chooses to alleviate these problems. And the ultimate result of all of this cannot be more clearly shown than in this chart, because it really has been. I talk about the past decade and the amount of damage done in the past decade. Well, let's just have a look at that in the actual numbers. Prior to around about 2012, South Africa used to move more or less in lockstep with world GDP growth. The two lines used to sit on top of each other, and that's a trend that existed long before even the early days of this chart. I've pinned it to 94 because that's, South Africa's birth of the birth of South Africa's democracy. But this chart existed for a very long time, up until about 2012, when we saw that deviation materialize. And that deviation neatly coincides with the emergence of load shedding and state-owned enterprise underperformance, state capture projects, and the like. And you can see how the two lines deviate significantly. Now, had we continued to perform as we had done for all of those decades prior to this, South Africa's economy right now would be some 21% larger than it is. Let that sink in for a second, because we're talking about an economy that has lost in opportunity something in the order of about R1 trillion per annum of GDP. Let that sink in for a moment, because we're talking about unemployment rates of 32% that might have been in the teens. We are talking about a government revenue which could have been so substantially larger that we could have afforded to pay for so much more. And yet here we sit with policies that do not address this lower trajectory of GDP. And this is why, and I continue to hold this view, that until such time as I see policies that turn that black line higher, such that we can at least move in parallel with what's going on internationally, South Africa is doing a bad job and its policies are being shown up. And so, again, as long as we persist down the roads of these policies that we continue to hold on to, and that this government holds on to its centrist objectives of having to manage and control everything, I do not believe that whilst we have shunned a meritocratic process in favor of cadre deployment, that we will see any improvement. So I'm hoping, Ilse Marie and listeners, that this upcoming election does deal a blow to the ANC. I'm hoping that we do get a shake-up of the political order, so that we can start thinking more critically about these policies and perhaps adopt a different approach that might shake the tree and get us moving in a more constructive environment. And politics, unfortunately, obviously play a role. When you're fighting for relevance and you're fighting for survival, and you can see that your numbers are dwindling, what you will not do is potentially adopt the kind of policies that you should be adopting if your objective was genuinely fiscal sustainability. South Africa is not on a fiscally sustainable path. And so when I had a look at this chart, and we've conducted our own studies on fiscal resilience, what we have found is that South Africa sits right down at the bottom of the log of fiscal resilience. Now, we've run this over 22 countries. It's the same methodology applied to all of these different countries. Interestingly, the countries that sit towards the bottom of this fiscal resilience score are also countries that are facing upcoming elections. Now, I mean, it's not a deep dive, thorough thing, but to me, it strikes me as more than mere coincidence that the countries that are approaching elections and that are starting to pay attention to what the voting public and how the voting public might respond and vote are also the countries that have been less than frugal in the way that they have spent their money, and they have done so in a way that is not conducive to promoting fiscal resilience. So the net result in the last two slides is to give you a sense of the risk factor that is now priced into financial markets. And again, this is just objectively looking at how these markets are priced. Let's start with the bond market. And we look back to the days of Trevor Manuel and Thabo Mbeki, and I would call that the golden era of South Africa, when we were running budget surpluses, when we had GDP growth rate of 6% plus, when we were able to spend tremendous amounts on infrastructure, when the effects of state capture hadn't impacted, and we were not dealing with the likes of load shedding, and this government generally did not impose itself on the private sector in the way that it did in the years that followed. We had an environment where bond yields generally traded below the coupon rates at which those bonds were initially launched and issued. You roll forward to today, and you see how the situation has changed, and all of a sudden we are sitting with bond yields significantly higher than coupon rates. If you wanted to understand what fiscal premiums look like, this chart gives it to you. And it paints a beautiful picture for you. It tells you that we are paying a good 2.5% to 3% more on what we borrow as a government than what we should be. And that's purely an international market that has spoken and told us that if you are going to continue down this path and fill your economy with the risk that you do, then we are going to need to charge you higher interest rates in order to lend you money, or we simply won't lend you that money. And of course, South Africa doesn't have an option but to accept those terms, because it has relinquished its fiscal sovereignty by virtue of it running a fiscal policy that simply hasn't been prudent enough. As I said before, financial markets tend to reward governments that run prudently, not governments that appear to waste money and ignore warnings and continue to go down policy paths that have failed repeatedly. So when you have a look at the table on the left, and you look at all of these countries to which we've conducted the exact same study, it should not surprise you that South Africa is top of the ladder, and not for a good reason. It means that we are paying a lot more on our debt than we should. And unfortunately, it tends to result in a currency that weakens. And so, we can look at this Jafekra account as reserves that we can tap into, but I can assure you that this government wouldn't have done so if it had been running itself prudently and was running a budget surplus and looking after its finances and not adopting the kind of policies that it has. So the currency has underperformed. It's underperformed for a very long time now. This is just a chart from the beginning of last year to date, and you can see that South Africa, being the black line, is better only than two countries, and that's Russia and Turkey, both of which are basket cases and not particularly good countries to compare ourselves to. Versus all the other emerging markets, we have underperformed, and you need to ask yourself why. Do you think that a currency of a country that is performing well would be performing like this? The answer, quite frankly, is no, it wouldn't. And so we need to pay attention to the signals that are being given in the financial markets. They are very real signals. They are signals that impact the way that this government funds itself and the way that the private sector has to fund itself, as well as deal with the currency issues that it does. And so, with that, I'm going to close off, Ilse Marie. I've given a very different perspective to perhaps the previous speakers, but it's, as always, my perspective. It's a critical assessment of what this government has been up to. And I'm very happy to have debates about it, but it's the numbers that speak to me, and the numbers at the moment don't look good.
No, you can't fool the data, that's for sure. And like you said, this has been building for a number of years, this decline. It didn't just happen overnight. And in my previous life as a journalist, I sat through many, many, many budgets. And without fail, National Treasury's projections have always been too optimistic, whether that was the debt trajectory, whether that was for GDP growth, they're always overestimated. So this thing of we won't hit that 80% debt to GDP ratio, I will advise to take it with a pinch of salt, just from my own personal experience. And actually, the finance guy, he made the perfect comment to your presentation, George. He said even Rusty would struggle to build an inspiring bull case here, which I think rings very true. And I want to allow you to comment on this, because it has been the hot potato throughout the news headlines. We see everyone talking about it. As an opportunity, he mentioned it, Oscar mentioned it, but it's this tapping into our reserves, the 150 billion rand reserves. Are we dipping into a party pot that we're gonna find ourselves burning our fingers with?
Ilse Marie, for me, it's a case of, just because you're allowed to do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. I don't deny that the National Treasury can tap into those reserves. Of course, they're entitled to it. It's not the first time that the reserves have been used. They were used in 1998 when the Reserve Bank tried to defend against an emerging market crisis that took place at the time, and they built up what was then called the net open forward position. And government, through the course of the years that followed, had to dip into its own pockets to try and rebuild those buffers and pay back the overdraft that was the overdraft facility that was built up by the, in my opinion, incorrect and wasteful use of those reserves. But those reserves are there as a buffer against rainy days. If we think that these are rainy days, think back to what COVID looked like. Think back to what the 2009 crisis looked like. Those, to me, are rainy days. This is a benign environment that we're living in at the moment. The reason why we're sitting in the difficulties that we're sitting in right now is because of years and years and years of maladministration of SOEs and other government institutions. So as far as I'm concerned, this wasn't the time to use this. This we are utilizing right now to kick the can down the road and delay what would have been potentially a fiscal crisis that hits the country a whole lot earlier. And it's not that this is an insurmountable situation. South Africa can turn itself around, and it can do so, I think, in a relatively short space of time. But we've got to change the way we think about the world. We've got to change our ideologies. We've got to, Finance Minister Godongwana spoke about crowding in the private sector yesterday, but we're doing it at the margins. We're not doing it wholesale. There've been examples around the world, and two that come to mind are Singapore and Ireland. At different stages of their economic evolution. And in both cases, they unleashed tremendous amounts of economic growth following privatization programs that they unleashed on their countries. And they did so not fully privatizing. They went with a partial privatization model that allowed these companies to list. These companies were suddenly imposed with tremendous transparency and accountability and activism on the part of shareholders. All of a sudden, these companies started behaving like efficient, productive, constructive companies. And lo and behold, they had an enormous impact on the performance of both Ireland as well as Singapore. And we know there are other examples around the world where this has been done. And so South Africa can't claim that it is somehow separate and different and operates on a different set of rules to basic economic principles. I think that there is an opportunity for South Africa to make a huge improvement on its lot if it just considers doing things a little bit differently. And by crowding in the private sector, I'm talking about doing it wholesale. We've already done it once with Telkom, and Telkom is a listed company. It works well. It's a profit-making company. We've got another example in SAA. Well, I'm suggesting that we do this for Eskom, for the post office, for the ports, for all of it, for the trains, PRASA, Transnet, the whole lot. I want to see the private sector included properly, because whilst the private sector may not be perfect, it sure as hell can't be doing a worse job than what we've got right now. And it's always going to have the added benefit to the country that boards and companies will be held to account. If they don't do a good job, they will fail. And so that is something that keeps the boards honest and makes sure that the people running them are concentrating on doing a better job than what we're seeing at the moment. So, getting back to your question on reserves, we've plugged a hole. But we haven't solved any of the issues. Eskom is still running at a loss. Transnet's been turning into a disaster for this country. And until such time as we fix those, using the Jafekra account to buy us another 2 or 3 years, well, I just don't see how that helps. All we're going to be left with is less money in the reserves and SOEs that are still not functioning properly because we haven't tackled the root cause of the issue. And to my mind, we've got the wrong people running these companies, and they've been too politicized and for too long. And quite frankly, they need to be reformed dramatically.
George, if I could just come in here right towards the end of your discussion now, you said we've got the wrong people running it. We keep on speaking about involving the private sector and SOEs needing money and the failing of SOEs, etc. I don't think it's necessarily always that the private sector does better. I don't think necessarily it will go better if the private sector does it. I think what we really need is competent people in the SOEs to run the SOEs. They've been run by people, whether it's private sector, whether it's an SOE, it's always run by people. It's always people managing it. It's the right people that should manage it. And if the right people manages it, then it can be successful even as a state entity.
Yeah,
That's
so Andre, I don't know if you've been... Yeah, so Andre, I don't know if you've been watching what's been coming out on News 24 over the past couple of days, but there's been specifically talking about these cadre deployment documents as they've been released. And in these cadre deployment documents, it's very clear that the ANC's deployment committee has been fully in charge of who gets to run what where. It is a completely politicized situation. There's been no meritocratic process that's taken place there. And the results of it are very clear to see. If it wasn't the case, and I agree with you, by the way, it's not that we don't see room for an entrepreneurial type of government in that can exist. I mean, we've seen it done. Singapore's done it. Singapore owns a lot, still has a really large influence on how that country runs and operates. But it does so with very different principles at its core. And so you're right. If you put the right people in, things can turn around. I'm just suggesting, and as I mentioned it a little bit earlier, that a lot of the skill sets at the moment sit within the private sector. If you want to tap into them, then potentially one good way of doing it is to include the private sector. So that's where I'm coming from. I never for once intimated that we should be selling everything lock, stock, and barrel to the private sector. Private sector is littered with examples of wrongdoing, of people in the highest office that have done poorly, and state capture reflected that too. So I'm not blind to that. I'm just saying that in the private sector, things are allowed to fail. And because they're allowed to fail, there is an added incentive for people to do a better job at running things. And I cannot believe that allowing the private sector to play a better role right now, in whatever form that takes, is going to do a worse job than what we've seen.
I think if I may come in, I mean, I on the people issue. I mean, it's when things are working well, we don't talk about cadre deployment. I mean, Kiswetter is doing a marvelous job at SARS, and I would argue it was a cadre deployment. Government decided to bring Kiswetter in. Government decided to bring Batoy into the NPA. So when things are working fine, then there's no issue with cadre deployment. So it boils down to Andre's point. It is about putting good people in those positions. The trust deficit that's there, coming to the ideology issue. There is a trust deficit. I hear Busa and BLSA and so on all talking about involvement of the private sector. They can do a better job, etc. But the truth is that there is a trust deficit with regards to government, and it's an ideological thing, because at the end of the day, the emphasis for the private sector is profit. And so whether you're running Transnet, whether you're running Eskom, there's always going to be a consideration of profit. And government and those in the ruling party are simply skeptical that the consumer, at the end of the day, is going to be bearing the brunt if we just wholesale privatize. So it is an ideological issue. I think President Ramaphosa is hinting at that with the breaking up of Eskom and wanting to invite more private sector involvement in the energy field. I think slowly South Africa is moving in that direction, where eventually we are going to have to look at options of partly privatizing and so on and so forth. It is also about the electoral outcome. And I think it is an important point to make that as long as people vote for you, even with these so-called wrong policies and so forth, there is no incentive to change, quite honestly. And so George's point is correct. Until there is a shake-up post this current election that's coming up, and the ANC realizes that it needs to shift gear, it's simply not going to do it at the pace that is required. If they get elected in again with a comfortable majority, 50 plus, then they're going to say, oh, well, the electorate don't feel that we are on the wrong policy trajectory. They still want us to be in charge of these SOEs, clearly, and therefore we will continue. And so it does boil down to that as well, where the electorate is going to have to punish the ruling party if indeed they feel that they are not coming out the other side in terms of these policy choices.
Dr. Van Heerden, I agree with you 100%, and that's there needs to be change in who governs us and how we're being governed. And that's each and other of us around any tables. That's our jobs, to actually go out and in layman's terms explain to the less fortunate and the less educated how important it is to go and vote and how things can change for them for the better if they vote for the right people. That's our job as an educational, from okay. But I want to go back to our golden foreign exchange reserves first of all, because I am in slight disagreement as to the use of that and the not use of that. If I listened to the minister yesterday, he's taking 150 billion off that, and he's repaying debt of 100 billion. So I'm taking from my savings and I'm making my debt less. If I make my debt less, my interest burden becomes less. My GDP ratios and all those of debt and deficits becomes better. So I'm looking better. If I take the money from my savings pot and I go and spend it on more social welfare or on other operational expenditures like salaries, etc., that's very, very dangerous. And I don't think that should ever happen. But if I repay some of my debt and get to a point where I make less debt so that my ratio starts looking better, I personally do not have a problem with it. And it is not anybody else's money than the government's money to use it. But that's a savings account and should be used to repay debt, never to do any operational expenditure. So with how Mr. Godongwana is actually handling it this time, repaying debt, I think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all. One of the biggest problems that I had is I was listening to a minister yesterday, And that minister said, very, very proudly, that we are now paying 20 million people, and she was really proud of that figure. 20 million people is now receiving grants. I don't have a problem with a grant. I think we should pay grants to people that doesn't have money. I agree with Dr. Oscar van Heerden once again, 100%. You've got to have cash in hand. But I would be a lot prouder if I can say, we paid 20 million people last year and we're paying 18 million people this year because we created 2 million jobs. That to me would be the right emphasis. How do I productively spend my money? How do I create jobs? How do I put people in work and get people off my social welfare payroll? That's the emphasis. That's not what I've seen in the budget. That's not how I see that they're spending money. There was too much emphasis on buying and playing into the hands of government employees and teachers and nurses by saying, we'll pay you your salaries, etc., etc. And that's too much emphasis on on the operational spending and far too less on creating positions, creating jobs, getting people off the social welfare payroll.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you on that. It's about, at the end of the day, we all knew going into this budget, like all budgets, it's going to be a juggling act. You're not going to satisfy all quarters of the pie, but it is about trying to introduce stability, trying to allay fears, both from government employees, as you say, in terms of salaries, etc. It's a far cry, and I know it's not about two wrongs make a right, but it's a far cry of a situation where we don't have money to pay public servants. At least we are just allaying fears to say there is still money. We're still being able to pay everyone, but it is a balancing act. There are obvious pitfalls and potholes that are still there, literally and figuratively, that needs attention.
I just quickly want to jump to some of the questions that's coming through. By the way, if any of the viewers have questions for our panelists, please post them in the comment section and we'll move through them. Alison Barker, she wants to know one of the panelists' views on the two-pot system that's coming in and the government's projecting revenue generation from it. She says South Africa has done well to build this compulsory savings industry, and now this too is being drawn down. Good move to allow people to access that. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's kicking in later this year.
I don't know who wants to take that question, but
I think
it's a cautious thing. It's very cautious. It's people's savings. And if it's handled incorrectly by the owner of the pension fund, then it could very well add at the end of his or her life more social welfare that's needed because they've used too much of their money. I think there's a lot of people with a huge amount of debt, drowning in their debt. And I'm going to just look at state employees on a state salary. You know that they are, if you look at their benefits, contributing 20% to a pension fund every month. The barometer out there says I must save 15% of my income every month to have a good pension fund, but the government employees are actually saving 20%. So they're almost richer at the end of their life than they are during their life. So if your pension fund is sound and you can draw down on that, I'm just going to reiterate what I said about golden foreign exchange reserves. If you take money out of your pension fund, don't go and buy food with it. Repay some of your debt so that your operational expenditure becomes lower so that you can start living within your means. So if you repay debt with it, cool bananas. If you start
Dr. Azar, your thoughts also? Do you agree with Andre?
Yes, I do. Totally. And also with the GFRECRA account, and I made the point that the one encouraging feature was that it was used to retire debt rather than to go towards wasteful expenditure. You can go one step further and say the danger about that is that it's, in a way, an artificial way of reducing your indebtedness in such a way as to encourage you then to become profligate afterwards again. That's what you've got to be very careful of. But I think with the two-pot system, there is some sense in dividing up the pension into 1/3 that goes towards enabling you to pay off the debt, but the other 2/3 has to remain part of the longer-term picture of paying you a pension. It's not dissimilar from ordinary retirement annuity funds, where the only difference is that with RAs, you only cash them in at the age of 55, whereas, and you're obliged, you can take 1/3 in cash, the other 2/3 remain as a pension. So this is not totally dissimilar. It's just that this kicks in, I think, can kick in before the age of 55. Again, that's kind of arbitrary. So I think it's there've been far worse proposals than this. I don't believe, though, that the 1/3 will be sufficient for many of the people in the kind of financial predicament that they're in. And the real temptation will be to actually use the money not for debt repayment, but for other purposes. And in that sense, I totally agree with Andre. And could I also say the whole concept, coming back to the previous discussion of private versus public, what people forget, and this is where there's an potential ideological fault line in the whole question of privatization versus state deciding on everything. In a private sector environment, if you have a shareholder who basically invests in a project and derives a return, he will make it go out of his way to ensure that that operation is run efficiently so that he can actually make that return. The ideological counter to that is, but he's just going to exploit everything in order to make as big a return as possible. And that is why we don't want the private sector involved. But essentially, at the end of the day, you only start getting efficiencies and competence when there is an incentive to ensure that a company or an entity is run profitably. When it's a government running it, you don't have the same accountability other than with the electorate. And then you come to Dr. Van Heerden's comment that if the electorate keeps saying, well, too bad, doesn't matter, let the government carry on running it, and you don't take action again, well, you're not going to generate the competence that is really required to run such an operation efficiently.
If I could just add one more
Jules.
thing onto the two-part system. One of the potential consequences, we should always just keep this in mind, is the minute we do switch to the two-part system, there is a possibility or a reasonable probability that a lot of people are going to pull what money they can up front. As I don't know if you remember the exact figures, we sat in that roundtable discussion at the Reserve Bank where I think the figure of about 50 billion rand comes to mind, that might be deployed very quickly through an economy more consumptive than anything else, which could have a very significant impact, albeit short-term impact on GDP growth. So that's something to keep in mind. It might actually even generate a slight positive upside surprise to GDP growth if it were to materialize, as some people think that it might. So it's an interesting kind of byproduct of what might happen if people are allowed to tap into their savings early. But as I don't know if I've got that number right, or if you've got anything to add on to that.
I think it was actually even greater than that. I think it was more important. But the counter to that again was that are the institutions institutional administrative arrangements sufficiently in place to be able to process such a huge demand that might come through there, so that in practice, it may practically only take place over a period of time to wash away the volatility that could come about in terms of the impact of consumer spending.
I think before we just jump to the international markets and taking a bit of a look at what we can expect on the international front, there was one in the budget review, one line that I read, and if you've been following some of the academic papers around this, you would have spotted it. There were a couple of other companies who've come to the conclusion on their own research. But National Treasury also said, and I can quote this, its internal estimates confirm that the fiscal multiplier is below 1, meaning higher government spending has not been contributing to higher economic growth. And it's mainly obviously due to the debt that's crowding out private sector or private investment. George, I want to start with you on this, because to me, this says that the more money government tries to invest, it's not going to pull us out of it. So why, when their own data is suggesting this, it almost feels like government is trying to still swing the opposite way in placing the state at the very center of the economy?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Ilse Marie, and I think if I can just jump in there, it's not the case that all governments have suffer from such a low multiplier. There are some governments out there, and I've just recently presented to one in the Middle East, where their multipliers were significantly higher than 1. In other words, for every R1 that was being spent in an economy, it was being done in such a productive, constructive way that there was a stronger response to that R1 that was spent in the economy. And so that makes obvious sense. If you're getting back more than what you're spending, that's a good productive use of your money. In the event that that you for every R1 that you're spending, you're getting less back, well, then you really do need to think very long and hard about how you or what role you choose to play in generating government growth. And perhaps we need to start thinking more along the lines of government becoming an enabler of growth rather than a driver of it. And by that, I mean play less of an active role and focus more on generating the kind of policies that will allow the private sector to do what it does best and just get out of the way. And sometimes I think that we forget that oftentimes the best solution is sometimes the simplest one, and it's just that, So it's recognizing the limitations of your abilities and defaulting the influence and the power to that area of the economy that can perhaps do a better job.
I would have loved to pose that question to Dr. Oscar van Heerden as well, but I want us to move quickly to international happenings. We know there are a number of elections taking place around the world. Most significantly, the European Parliament will be going into elections, India, also Russia, and of course, United States of America, where we know Trump has put his name in the hat for a second running. Whether he's going to get it, it's a good question. But if you look at the polls, they're backing this man to get back into the White House. If someone like Trump comes in and we see a continuous trend of more protectionist policies, what should be South Africa's concerns, or even Africa's concerns, whether that be for trade or the currency, when these type of policies start taking more effect?
I think there should indeed be a concern on the part of Africa and South Africa, especially regarding a Trump administration. Trump has already mooted imposing a 10% import tariffs on all products that come into the United States. If that is the case, then of course that policy runs totally counter to AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, which provides African countries with preferential tariffs they can export without having to pay tariffs into the United States. If Trump comes into office, I think there is a severe chance that not only South Africa, but the whole of Africa actually loses the AGOA benefits. And more than that, the world as a whole runs the risk of actually moving into more deglobalization and losing the huge benefits that globalization brought to bear in terms of improving overall global economic growth. And of course, the biggest danger of all is the imposition of tariffs on China. Trump has been quoted as saying 60% tariff on imports. Right. Now, if that is the case, that could be disastrous for global economic activity, but it could have knock-on effects. It would raise the ire of China to such an extent that the whole issue of Taiwan becomes far more emotive, and you could have a geopolitical conflagration that has far greater ramifications than Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Hamas. So I am quite scared of a Trump presidency, I have to admit. And the danger of this is what we're seeing is this spreading far broader than just being confined to the United States. It is generating a huge divide and polarization between extreme right wing and extreme left wing that is, again, not conducive towards improved economic growth of the kind we saw in the first decade of the 21st century. And of course, higher tariffs on imports tend to push up inflation, and that in turn translates into interest rates maybe needing to be even higher than what people are anticipating. Again, negative for global economic growth. South Africa would suffer in such an environment. The rand would fall out of bed, and we would suffer higher inflation, impoverishing the poor, as the Reserve Bank governor often says.
There is potentially a flip side to this whole debate as well. And there's no doubt Trump is going to be disruptive, but we also need to pay attention to what has been driving some of America's extraordinary GDP growth. I mean, they just seem to defy gravity and are able to print growth rates and hold their labor market tight, and everything seems to be going just beautifully for them, despite all these indicators that we're seeing that are telling us things should be happening differently. At least a couple of the drivers of that GDP growth being military spending, number one, and number two, very strong government spending, are both things that Trump is talking about reducing. He wants to bring an end to wars, and he wants to tighten up on some of that government spending. Now, the interesting thing there is that if he inadvertently does away with this kind of this perception of US exceptionalism, where America can just continue producing this growth rate regardless of what the central bank does, all of a sudden, if the momentum behind that GDP growth starts to dissipate, I foresee an environment where the Fed all of a sudden is forced into turning a lot looser on their monetary policy. And the dollar, interestingly enough, under that scenario, could come in for a bit of a correction. Now, that raises some interesting dynamics for countries around the world, because if the dollar's under pressure, could other currencies start to recover? And if they do start to recover, does that mean that the inflation rates in their countries start to decline? In which case, are you staring at an environment where interest rates could come down as a result of Trump coming in? So there's some interesting scenarios that could play out on that front, which might run counterintuitively, actually, but there's no doubt in my mind that a Trump presidency is going to be disruptive, and sometimes that disruption can usher in a whole new era of doing business differently, which isn't always a bad thing.
Andre, your last thoughts on it before we wrap up?
Love him or hate him, he's going to be disruptive. That's Mr. Trump.
That's about the only thing we can count on.
That's his life story. And some people will like him and some people will dislike him. But what we do know is after 4 years having been in power, it's all about making America great. And going back to what Dr. Jamin said, that holds a threat for globalization and the positives of globalization, because it's all internally focused. If you look at politics in quite a few countries at this point in time, that is actually the situation. There's a lot more focus on how do I do better, or how do we as a country do better, and how do we look after ourselves before we look after anybody else. But last comment, is going to be disruptive. End of the story.
Well, we're going to have to wait and see. There's so many uncertainties that still have to play out this year before anyone can take a guess on how this is going to end up. And one of them being towards the end of May with South Africa's elections. It's all good and well to put in place a budget, but quite frankly, I think I'm not as confident to believe that I know exactly what's going to come out of South Africa's elections. So, everything is still very much up in the air. But hopefully there will be some direction come end of May, and may the geopolitical dynamics be gracious towards South Africa's fiscal recovery. But on that point, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me. I know that Dr. Oscar van Heerden is unfortunately having some connectivity issues, but thank you for him for joining us. George, Azar, Andre, thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of the week. To the viewers, thank you for joining in as well.